Well, welcome to another Friday night. We're pushing along in our series on reparenting, which is what has to happen as we heal from trauma. And today we're coming to failure. And the reality of life is that we fail. Children fail. Children fail sometimes by disobeying us. They don't do what we ask them to do, but sometimes they fail just by doing things that hurt others, that they're conscious of or not conscious of, by letting people down as far as their expectations, by letting themselves down, by not fulfilling their goals, by not accomplishing the things that they hope to accomplish. Failure is part of life. It is something that everybody experiences, and so it's part of growing up. It's part of learning. And that's the key concept, because in complex trauma, failure is usually not responded to in a healthy way. And so instead of the child learning from it, which is what would happen in a healthy home, it is something that creates a whole bunch of negative patterns in their life that end up making things worse for the child, that set off a whole bunch of systems that cause them to fail even more. And so for a person coming out of complex trauma, failure is a very scary thing, but a very dangerous thing for them. And so part of growth and recovery is learning to reparent yourself in the sense that you respond to failure in a new way, in a healthy way, in a way that results in learning and growth, not in destructive patterns. So we have to begin by understanding that there are different types of failure. So the first one is what many of us put all failure under, and that's what we would call moral failure. So moral failure is what we'd call doing something wrong or doing something bad. It is when we do something that violates a moral standard, or how I like to present it is moral failure is really doing something that violates love. It's choosing to hurt others, choosing to do something that's against love, that's against justice, that's against respect. So that would be a moral failure. But there's other types of failures where you're not choosing to hurt others. So they're not necessarily what we would say is a bad failure, a bad behavior. So all of us are going to have ways that we hurt others, but we're not even conscious of it. So sometimes when you act out of fear, you go into avoid mode, and by going into avoid mode, you might do something that hurts others. Or by acting out of your shame, you're not even aware that you're putting on a mask, and that's hurting others. That's preventing authentic connection. So people coming out of complex trauma have all kinds of subconscious things that they do that are just old survival tools and techniques, and they're not even aware that they're using them in ways that hurt others, and that's just part of their life. Others, we fail because we didn't have the right training. So you could say that a child who has never been taught to tie their shoe, that when they go to tie their shoe and they can't do it, they failed. But you don't beat them up for that because they never were taught. And a child who was never taught to ride their bike, and they go and they try to ride their bike all on their own and they keep falling off, you say you're failing. But it's not because of some morally wrong, it's they were never taught. It's not their fault that they're failing. And then we have failure just due to being human. So we fail because we forget to do some things once in a while. We remind ourselves in the morning, don't forget to do this, and then we forget. That's a failure, but it's because we're human. Or you might be in a job and it's the only job you can get right now and it requires you working afternoons. And so now you can't be there for your kids the way you would like, and you feel like a failure as a dad. But the circumstances of life, that's just the way it is, and it just doesn't feel good. And then all of us are going to have some sense of failure when it comes to not achieving the goals that we set for ourselves. So you might have set a goal to get straight A's, but then you got A's and a bunch of B's, and you feel like a failure. You haven't necessarily truly failed, you failed to reach your goals. So those things can happen, and we would put them under the category of failure. And then every time you learn a new skill, so the child learning to tie his shoes, you've taught them how to tie their shoes, but it doesn't mean they're going to do it perfectly the first time. So every time you learn a new skill, there's failure involved in perfecting the use of the tools in that skill. So those are all different types of failure. Now, how is failure responded to in a healthy home? So the big picture I want you to get: in a healthy home, failure is something that the parents want the child to learn from. They want to turn what the child sees as a negative into a positive and make it a learning experience. So the moral failure is the tricky one, because if the child is purposely rebelling, so they're lying, they're being abusive to their brother, what do you do with that failure? Well, you want to see the child change their behavior, but also have a change of heart. You want to see them stop living in unloving ways, because if they continue to, it's going to really damage their life in the future. And so you want them to know there's consequences for moral failure that can be immediate and can be long-term. That if you keep lying, people are going to stop trusting you, and it's going to damage all your relationships. And so what you hope will come out of that is that the child will stop the lying, but also that they'll be sorry, genuinely sorry, and they'll want to run to you and just say, "I'm so sorry, please forgive me," and want to be restored to the loving relationship that the lying seemed to get in the way of. And that is the goal, is that restoration. You don't want the child to go off and beat themselves up and get down on themselves and isolate themselves to punish themselves. You want them to run back to you and with an open heart and a changed heart be sorry. So that's what you want, but you want them in all of that to learn from it. But then all the other types of failure, you don't want to beat that child up. You want that child just to, what could you learn from that falling off your bike? What can you do differently? What can you learn from that relationship with your friend where you maybe weren't as attentive as you should have? What can you do differently? Let's learn. So failure is not seen as a bad thing that you need to be punished for. Failure is seen as an opportunity to learn and to grow. It is something that is turned into a positive thing. So this is so important to understand. So let me take it to a bigger perspective and just read you some quotes that have been written about failure that I think are so important just to help us understand it. So, success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And that's Winston Churchill. And he also said, success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. I like that one. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's part of success. So true. And then Albert Einstein said, a person who never made a mistake never tried anything new. Chris Bradford said, each mistake teaches you something new about yourself. There is no failure, remember, except in no longer trying. It is the courage to continue that counts. And Michael Jordan said, I can accept failure. Everyone fails at something, but I can't accept not trying. Failure is an inescapable part of life and a critically important part of any successful life. And then Ellen DeGeneres said, when you take risks, you learn that there will be times when you succeed and there will be times when you fail. And both are equally important. Now, there's one other piece that you need to understand when we talk about failure. Moral failure is the one that causes us to have long-term negative consequences if we don't change it. And so built into us is this thing called a conscience, our guilt meter. And so when we do something that violates love, something that violates respect or justice, it causes us to feel negative, painful emotions. We feel guilt. And the goal of that is to create an internal pain that says to us, don't keep doing that. It's not worth it. You'll just be discontent. You won't be happy. It'll just cause you to live with this internal pain. So correct the behavior. So the goal of the conscience is that it is always on guard. It is alert to anything that steps outside of love so that it can push us back into love, so that it can keep us on the right track. It is there to protect us. It is there to guide us. The problem is that the conscience can be mistrained. And complex trauma families tend to mistrain the conscience. So what happens now, a child of complex trauma, they feel guilty for expressing their needs. They say, I would like this, I need this, and they get told you're selfish, and now they feel guilty for expressing their needs. They are made to feel guilty for setting a boundary. That's made to feel like they're unloving or that they're selfish. They are made to feel guilty for expressing certain emotions like sadness or anger or fear. They're made to feel guilty if they take care of their own needs and they say, I need a bit of self-care time. They're made to feel that they're selfish. If they talk about some of the family secrets, they're made to feel that they're disloyal. And so in many, many ways, complex trauma mistrains the conscience. And this is a huge issue because now people end up with false guilt. They feel guilty even though they've done nothing wrong. They've done nothing truly morally wrong. And so now they have this conscience chirping at them all the time, making them feel that they're failing when they haven't truly failed. And so an important part of recovery is going to be retraining the conscience in an accurate way. And that can be a very difficult journey. So let's go further into how complex trauma families often respond to failures. And you can check off any of them that apply to your upbringing. So I want to begin with how parents respond to the child, and then I want to go to how parents respond to themselves when they fail. But let's begin with how parents respond to a child when the child fails. So many are severely punished. It is harsh. It is over the top. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. And that punishment can be doled out even though the child is truly sorry, even though the child has is wanting to change, they still are punished severely. Secondly, they can get shamed. They can get shamed big time. So it's not just that they fail and they go through the pain of failure. Now on top of that is heaped shame, which makes it even more painful. So they're told that they're useless. They're told that their parents are embarrassed of them. So now that's an extra pain. But something else is usually happening in complex trauma families, and that is a distinction isn't being made between the person's behavior and the person's identity. So if you fail, that means you're a failure. Where in a healthy home, if you fail, that doesn't mean you're a failure. You did something maybe wrong, but that doesn't mean you're bad. But in complex trauma, you did bad, you are bad. No distinction is made. So every failure just adds to the shame, identity, belief that I'm not good enough. I'm useless. I'll never get there. I'll never be good enough. Another response is that the parents get extremely angry. And then they lash out with long rants. They preach you long sermons. And what's really going on is the long rant doesn't benefit the child. It's just the parent dysregulated, and they're venting their dysregulated emotions, trying to make themselves feel better. But you might have had to endure long rants from very angry parents. Another thing that parents do when you fail is they treat you in disrespectful ways. They call you names. They call you down. And that just adds to the pain that you're feeling. Some, if you failed, they threatened you. They threatened that they were going to give you up for adoption. You were such a bad kid. They used lots of fear things. You're going to turn out and become living on the streets. You're going to end up in prison. All kinds of different fear tactics they tried to use on you. And then some, they told everybody about it. Do you know what my son just did? And they blabbed it to every relative, every neighbor. And that just added to the shame. And then every time something happened in your life where they weren't happy, they threw your failures in your face and reminded you of them over and over again. Some, when you failed, they went very passive-aggressive. They played games. They gave you the silent treatment. They withheld love. And then they made you feel guilty for stuff that really you didn't do anything wrong. So what I want you to see is that for a child, not only are they having failure, and the pain of that failure, but now they're getting all this extra pain on top of the failure. And so in the child's mind, what are they concluding? Never admit that you failed. Failure never leads to anything good. And if you admit it, it only leads to extra pain, extra shame, anger. All kinds of different pain will get piled on the pain of failure. So nothing good comes out of failure. So I want you to understand is what has happened there is the child has not been given a way to resolve the failure. All of that pain was heaped on, but they still feel like a failure. They still have no way to resolve it. And so they live with constant pain of their conscience, constant extra shame heaped on, with no way to resolve it. And so what many children do when you cannot resolve a painful emotion is to disconnect from it, to shut it down, to harden your heart, to become indifferent, to not care, to not have a conscience. And that is what many did in order to live with guilt and failure. Now let's go to what did the parents do when they failed? Totally different picture comes out. For many of your parents, they might have denied that they even failed, lied about it, or they might have minimized it. It's no big deal. It wasn't that bad. Nobody got hurt. So it was only like a tiny failure. Don't make such a big deal out of it. Or they might have said, well, at least it wasn't as bad as what that person did. Again, a way of trying to minimize it by comparing to others. Or they might have rationalized it or made excuses. Well, I'm so stressed out these days, and I had a really bad day, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. So you got to understand my anger in hitting you. It's really not my fault. It's just I'm having a bad day. And so always looking for a way to make an excuse for their behavior. Or blaming. Well, it wasn't my fault I hit you. It's because you drove me to it. Because you've had such a bad attitude. It's your fault. If you hadn't pushed my buttons, I never would have hit you. I never would have blown up like that. And so they try to turn it on the other person and blame somebody to exonerate themselves from it. So they're always twisting stuff to make it somebody else's fault. Or you'll get some parents who'll admit it academically, yeah, I failed, so what? But there's no change of behavior. So they admitted it, but they really aren't sorry for it. Or some, they just refuse to talk about it. They will never admit that they've done wrong. And so, if anybody brings it up, it's nope. They're not going to admit it. They're going to blame somebody, or they're not going to talk about it. And so what I want you to understand is, for many of your parents, they could never, in their own eyes, fail. Because failure to them would have been, people will lose respect for me. People will use my failures against me and humiliate me with them. Failure would be seen as weakness. So they had to come up with all of these games to play so that they would never face their failures. Whereas if their children failed, they would rub their children's nose in it to try to make them grovel and make them face it and hurt them and be punished for it. Totally opposite extreme responses to failure. How sad. A totally double standard. Now, what is really important for clients to understand as they begin to understand failure and how it was responded to by complex trauma families is to begin to understand the patterns they developed when they failed. So they couldn't resolve it in a healthy way in their home. So what did they do once they failed? So let me begin again with the narcissist. So the narcissist, they will do a couple things, but bottom line is they're not going to change, okay? So failure for them is not something that's going to lead to learning from it or changing. So they could immediately never admit they're wrong. They're never sorry. They will deny, they will blame, they will lie. They're just never going to go there. Or they're just totally indifferent. So I failed. Who cares? I don't care if I hurt anybody. They're never going to own it. Totally. Or you might get a narcissist in a relationship and they fail and they are full of profuse apologies. I'm sorry. The issue is they're not truly sorry. They're just sorry that you're upset and they want to make you happy again with them. So it's all about them, but they're not going to truly change. They're trying to change your attitude toward them. So the profuse apologies is actually a manipulation tool. And then for some, part of the reason for their profuse apologies is it's all about managing the crisis. managing their image. So you're upset, there's tension in the relationship, we have a crisis here, I need to get the relationship so there's no tension again. I got to manage the crisis. Once the crisis is gone, I will go back to my old behaviors. And so I am going to apologize to get you to not be upset with me, but then I'm going to make sure nobody else is upset with me. I got to manage my image. So that's how narcissists tend to respond to failure. But let's go to you. What are your patterns once you fail? So I want to look at what happens in your brain, what happens in your emotions, and what happens in your actions. So for many, once they fail in their thought life, they do a few things. Number one, they beat themselves up in their thinking. They call themselves names. They say these tapes in their head. You're a loser. You can't do anything right. You'll never get this. Nobody will ever want you. You're a hopeless case. You always screw everything. Like just tape, message after message. They just go over and over in their mind. Others in their mind, they also become obsessive in replaying the failure over and over and just beating themselves up each time. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. What will people think of me? And so they obsess on that and they can't stop thinking about it. And then a third thing can happen in their thinking. As they do those first two things, beating themselves up and obsessing, they get darker and darker in their thoughts about life in general, about others, about their job, about their future. It gets to be a darker and darker place in their mind. Then what's happening in their emotional world? Well, they're feeling guilt, that's for sure. But that's feeding their shame that they're not good enough, that they're not lovable, they're not valuable. They're less than everybody else. But it's also feeding an anger at themselves. So they don't just have guilt, is what I want you to see. They have all these other powerful negative emotions happening. And so beyond just being angry at themselves, it increases their anxiety. What are other people thinking? It increases their insecurity. It increases their depression. I'm a failure. I suck. Nobody's ever going to want a relationship with me. And that then feeds a hopelessness. So what I want you to understand is the pattern that's happening here is just taking you to a more negative place. More and more negative emotions. There's not one positive emotion that's coming out of that. So then how do you act that out? What happens in your actions? Well, some people that gets turned into self-harm. Some people, it gets turned into risky behavior. Basically, I need to punish myself, so I'm not going to go out and kill myself, but I'm going to flirt with very dangerous behaviors, and if I get hurt, that's okay, I deserve it. Others sabotage everything good. I don't deserve this because I'm bad. So I don't deserve a good life. I don't deserve good relationships. I don't deserve a good job. I'm going to start sabotaging all of those things. Others, they just isolate. I can't face people. I don't deserve relationships, so I'm going to just be all alone. Others go back into addictive, distracting, numbing behaviors. I can't live with all this pain and guilt. And so what I want you to see is this can happen subconsciously. You start to just numb out in some type of activity or in some type of addiction. All of those things you act out. And what's really happening in all of that is, I call it, you put yourself in the doghouse. So I grew up hearing, if you were bad, that your punishment, your justice, wasn't going to jail as a kid. It was, you're in the doghouse. And what that meant was, you're going to go through some self-punishment. You put yourself in a place where you cut yourself off from love. You don't let others love you. You close your heart to them loving you. And you beat yourself up. You get down on yourself. You're not open to anything good. You just push bad on yourself. And that's what you feel you deserve. Justice demands it. And so for some, you're in the doghouse for a day. Others a week, for 2 weeks, before you feel you've served your time for your crime. That is the pattern. So understand your pattern. What tends to happen when you fail? So what I want you to understand is that pattern never leads to anything good. Do you realize that when you beat yourself up and you go to all those negative emotions and you put yourself in the doghouse, that just makes you want to fail even more? It does not provide motivation long-term to want to change, to open myself up to what is good. It always ends up having the reverse effect to what we want. It backfires. So bottom line is, and there's been over 100 of studies that have said, what provides the right type of motivation for a person to want to make positive changes, to want to learn from failure, to really grow? Well, complex trauma, you're wired, you're oriented to think, beat yourself up, be hard on yourself, punish yourself. That will motivate you. And what they found is it only provides very short-term motivation. All the studies say there's one thing that provides the right long-term motivation. That is self-compassion and self-forgiveness. Where you, instead of beating yourself up, forgive yourself and have compassion to yourself. Now I'm going to come back to what that looks like in just a minute. But what I want you to understand is why it is important to forgive yourself. Why this becomes such an essential part of recovery is self-forgiveness, self-compassion. Because, and it's based on if you don't do it, here's what's going to end up happening. You're going to continue to need to punish yourself, beat yourself up. You're going to continue to feel you don't deserve anything good in life. So you're going to sabotage stuff. You're going to close your heart to receiving love, to receiving good things. That's going to increase your depression. It's going to increase your anxiety, your anger, your shame. And that pain is going to get so great inside of you, you don't have a healthy way to resolve it, so you have to go to unhealthy ways to resolve it, which are dissociating or addiction. Disconnecting, numbing, all of that is going to end up happening. And so, as you go through the old patterns and don't forgive yourself, just beat yourself up, it brings you to this place of discontent, dissatisfaction, this place of constant negative emotions, constant negative emotional pain that you eventually can no longer tolerate, and you numb. You disconnect. You dissociate. And that takes you to a very dangerous place. A place where you go back to addictions, back to suicidal thoughts, back to old behaviors that are very destructive. So nothing good will ever come from it. So what then does self-forgiveness, self-compassion look like? So begin with this. Part of your journey, if you come out of complex trauma, is going to be sorting out true moral guilt from false moral guilt. You're going to have been made to believe that a lot of the stuff that you do that is healthy is actually selfish. Setting boundaries, expressing your needs, meeting your needs. And so you have to sort out false guilt from true guilt. And part of that false guilt often is being made to feel more responsible for others than you actually are. So it's going to take time, and you're going to need help in sorting out true guilt from false guilt. And we spend a lot of our time in our LIFT program and REACT program helping clients sort that out. It is so important. But if it is true guilt, admit it. See it accurately. Don't minimize it. Don't blame others. Own it. Own your part. You cannot properly forgive yourself by minimizing, denying, justifying, blaming. You only come to true self-forgiveness by saying, yes, I did it. And then you go to the emotional part. So there's a remorse part that, oh, I feel so bad. Look at the hurt I've caused others. And you feel genuine remorse. That's in your limbic brain. But you can't stop there. Then you have to go to the action part, which is true repentance. So remorse is the emotion, but remorse in and of itself is not good enough unless it results in changed behavior. Repentance. And the word repentance simply means a 180-degree turn. I'm going this direction, I realize it's wrong, I go the opposite direction. I change my behavior. So a lot of narcissists, they might have remorse, but they don't change their behavior. And so the remorse is not sufficient. So you own it, you admit it, you see it accurately, you allow it to affect your emotions, and you're truly sorry, but then it affects your behavior. You change it to become healthy. Now, it's no shame to admit, I'm not sure how to do all of that. I might need a mentor or somebody, a coach who can help me sort out true guilt from false guilt, to figure out what my changed behavior needs to look like, to figure out if I need to make amends as part of being sorry. That is okay. That's part of relearning a healthy conscience, a properly trained conscience, and how to respond properly to guilt so I can resolve it and deal with it in a healthy way. But then learn from it. So failure isn't something that has to end up just in pain. It is something that you can benefit from. Something that you can learn about yourself. Learn what you can do differently in life. Learn a new tool. Learn a new skill. Always turn it into learning. Now I need to add this. For many people, especially moral failure in regards to your children. So you lied to them. You weren't there for them. You were abusive to them. You disrespected to them. You didn't connect to them because you were wrapped up in your own world and your own problems. And now you see the damage it's done to your children. You see that they have complex trauma. And it is crushing for you at times. So you say, okay, I have to forgive myself. That doesn't mean I go, it's not a big deal what I did. No, you've owned it. It is a big deal. What that means is I can't go back and redo it. All I can do now is change my behavior moving forward. And that's true repentance. That's saying, I'm going to learn from what I've done wrong. I'm going to learn healthy tools so that now I can be there for my children. Now I can meet their needs. Now I can connect with them. And I'm going to learn how to do that so that moving forward, they're going to have a different mom or dad. And that's the best way to make amends to my children, is to become a better person for them. And what you'll find if you do that is that will then help your children deal with their wounds and heal from their wounds. So it'll benefit you, but it will benefit them as well. So what I want you to also understand is this. As you move forward, you're going to have days where you see your children acting a certain way and you realize that's because of what I did. And all the regrets are going to flood back in. In those moments, part of you is going to want to feed into those regrets and start beating yourself up again. So part of forgiving yourself is an ongoing thing where every time a regret comes up, I go, no, I'm not going to feed into it. I'm going to keep working on myself. I'm not going to go back to beating myself up about that because I'm truly sorry. I am changing. And so you let go of the resentment to yourself. You let go of the regret of beating yourself up. So what I want you to understand is when the regret comes back, it takes you into your limbic brain. And your limbic brain feels bad about yourself, which then distorts your reasoning and says, I deserve to be punished. I should punish myself. So what you're doing is, no, I'm going to get out of my limbic brain because it's distorted right now. I'm going to get back into my cortex and say, we're not going to feed into that. We're not going to beat ourselves up. We're going to keep moving forward and keep on growing. So take that a little bit further. What I want you to see is forgiveness is a choice made in your cortex. We often want to think of forgiveness just as an emotion, that I feel good to myself. So here's what I want you to understand. You make the choice in your cortex. I will not punish myself. I let go of punishing myself. I choose not to punish myself. That's a choice. But your limbic brain isn't quite there yet. It is still going, I should punish myself. I feel terrible. But as you keep living in your cortex and choosing not to punish yourself, eventually your limbic brain heals and starts to feel better about yourself and starts to feel forgiveness. But it starts in your cortex. So let me just end with this quote. You are not a failure, and you need to quit telling yourself that you could have avoided failing because no successful person ever avoids the pain in hopes for the gains. So you are not a failure. You have done things, yes. But now, instead of beating yourself up, learn from it. Forgive yourself. Move forward. That is reparenting. That's the end of part 1. Again, I hope that was helpful for you. We're going to take a short break and then come back for part 2, which is a Christian part. If that's of no interest to you, that's fine with us. You're free to go. We'll see you next Friday. Everybody else will be back in just a minute. Well, welcome back. We're coming to the last talk we're going to do in the story of Esther, and I hope it's been an insightful story for you. It's one of my favorites. Last time we ended with the king had come to realize that the decree that Haman had talked him into making, that he had signed blindly, was all about killing off the Jewish people. And here his queen was a Jew. The man who had saved his life was a Jew. And he realized, wow, this is a terrible decree. But he couldn't undo that decree in that culture. So he made a second decree, which said, on the day that the Jews are to be wiped out, I give permission for the Jews to defend themselves. So let me just read what happens in chapter 9. So on March 7th, that was the day that Haman, by throwing dice, had decided was the right day to wipe out the Jews. So the Purim, the dice, the lots had been cast. So March 7th, the two decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. But no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, so the high government people, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews. Why? Because they feared Mordecai. Mordecai, they knew the king really respected and had honored and given Haman's position, and so they did not want to cross him because they might lose their jobs. So Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. That very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther. He said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, what has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it. In other words, Esther, you guys have had great success. Just within this little area, 500 people have been killed. Wow, must be all kinds outside of here. It's been a great day. Is there anything else you want? So Esther responds, if it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to go again tomorrow, as they have today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Then the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8th and killed 300 more men. And again, they took no plunder. So they're basically saying, we're going to take the high road. We're going to defend ourselves, but we're not going to be in any way be perceived to be getting rich from this by taking plunder. So the Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th and again on March 8th, then rested on March 9th, making that their day of feasting and gladness. So to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in late winter, which is March 9th, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other. The festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. Now, what I want you to know is I only read a part of this chapter. The chapter goes on and on, repeatedly talking about the Feast of Purim and basically saying the same thing over and over again about people are going to celebrate the Feast of Purim. Make sure everybody knows to celebrate the Feast of Purim. So all kinds of ink is given to telling people about how the Feast of Purim started, getting them to practice it and making sure their ancestors practice it. And you go, why so much ink put into emphasizing the practice of the Feast of Purim? And I think the writer is doing it because he realizes Israel's going to be attacked again and again. And they are going to need to be reminded again and again of the Esther event. Because many of the attacks that Israel is going to experience in the future are going to feel very much like the Esther event. They're going to feel hopeless, number one, and they're going to feel, number two, that God's not even paying attention. And so Israel needs to be reminded repeatedly of the Esther event, that yes, you're going to be attacked. It might feel hopeless. It might feel that God doesn't care. But God made a promise to preserve the Jewish people, and He will keep it. So let me just give you a bit of history. So before Esther, Look at the Jewish people, and what you find is they were attacked repeatedly even before Esther. So Egypt attacked Israel and wanted to wipe them out. They put them into slavery and then killed all the firstborn sons. Basically, that was their plan for genocide. Then the people of Canaan wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. Then the neighboring nations during the time of the judges wanted to wipe out the Jewish people, and they looked to be quite close to being successful at times. Then Babylon, and then Esther's kingdom, the Medo-Persia, all wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. Attack after attack after attack. And then after Esther, what happened? Well, Greece wanted to wipe out the Jewish people, but the group of Maccabees rose up to defend in terrorist warfare, save the Jewish people. Then Rome took Israel out of their land in AD 70, and it looked terrible for them. And then other things, and then we come to Hitler, and he wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. Then Arab nations have attacked, wanting to drive them into the sea and wipe them out. Yes, they have been attacked over and over again. And it's very likely that even more attacks in the future will come. Here's what I want you to understand. God never promised to make their life easy. God never promised to preserve them from suffering just from annihilation. God never promised to give them an easy life. But he did promise to keep them in existence no matter how great the opposition or the enemy. No matter how hopeless it seemed, he would somehow bring them through it. And that has repeatedly happened over and over again. Somehow God has preserved them. God promised to keep his promises. And he has been faithful to his promise to Israel, which is, you will not be annihilated, even when it looks hopeless. God has promised to keep his promises to you. He has not promised you an easy life. There will be hardship. There will be opposition. That's part of living in this life. But he has promised to take bad and turn it into good. That if we surrender to him, if we cooperate with him, he will take all the crap that happens to us and turn it into positive growth for us, to make us more healthy, to make us more like Jesus. So that is his promise, not an easy life. And so we need to be reminded of the Esther story too. That even when life is overwhelming and looks hopeless and it doesn't seem like God cares, he's still there working. He's still there wanting to bring good out of it. And he will be faithful to his promise. And so the Feast of Purim has become a key feast in the Jewish life. And I hope the story of Esther will become an important part of your mental life as you move forward. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this story. Thank you for this reminder that it's really a story of how you work. A story that you work not in great miraculous miracles to make our lives easy and free of trouble. That you allow life to just happen in all of its pain and frustration and opposition. But you work quietly behind the scenes, often hidden ways. But you keep your promises, even when we don't see what you're doing. And just help us to trust your faithfulness. Amen. Well, that's the end of another Friday. Thank you again for being here with us. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.